Shalom, everybody on the YouTube, and we are getting ready to record a really exciting Kingdom Road radio show, and here I go right now. Yes, shalom, shalom, everyone. This is the Kingdom Road radio show, and this is your host, Joseph Israel, and this is a very exciting show today because I have a great guest with me, an author and Hebrew scholar, Nehemia Gordon. And Nehemia, thank you for joining us today. Welcome.
Shalom, Joseph. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is an honor, Nehemia. The evidence that you put forward in this book, what I'm holding up here, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence, and your online teachings and your website has really been very profound in our little study group community. And we posted some information on our website, israelofpromise.org, that was based on some of your findings over the past, all these years that you've been putting together and recently publishing in the last decade, a lot of this information. And I just have to say, for all the listeners and people who have been following what I've been doing all these years, for almost 20 years, I've been using the pronunciation Yahweh and really knowing in myself that this was the true pronunciation of the Father's name, of the Tetragrammaton, and there was very deep, attachment to it and very profound things in my life that happened that led me to understand the scriptures. But at the end of the day, after weighing all the evidence, we have to look at what the truth is. And coming to really understand these things based on Nehemia Gordon's research and other things that I found in myself on my own and with the help of others, YEHOVAH is accurate, and it is the most accurate that we have based on these ancient texts and the vocalization and true scholarship, not scholarly guesses. And so Nehemia Gordon, we're here today to really talk about this. And of course, there's people that are going to be against what we're going to bring out today, but we're not worried about them, but we want to open their mind because before I ask you anything, I want to say, I bought this book and I challenge anyone. I personally bought this book because I wanted to find the loophole in his reasoning. I wanted to be able to prove Nehemia Gordon wrong, but I wanted to do it in a real way. I didn't want to do it based on a theory of man, but based on true scholarship. And of course, me, living in America and learning Hebrew in my 20s and 30s would be able to understand more than someone that, speaks Hebrew every day and it's given their life to understanding, of course. But no, I was wrong. And we have to admit when we're wrong. And so, Nehemia, I'm very excited to ask you a few questions that people keep asking me about this. Sure. And so,
I really appreciate your intellectual honesty that you went into it. On the one hand, you said, I want to prove Nehemia wrong, but you also, said, okay, let's look at the evidence. And I really appreciate that, I think that's so important. I'm a Karaite Jew, and the Karaite tradition, we have this concept of search well in the scripture and do not rely on any man's opinion. And what that means is don't just blindly follow what I say. Don't blindly follow what anybody says. Even if I happen to be right, then you're basing your relationship with the creator of the universe on the words of a man rather than the words of the master of creation. And so the goal is really the objective should be to interact yourself with the word of God. And yeah, you can use resources, read my book, read other people's books, use resources, but then interact with it yourself. And I always, when I present on this, I show people the evidence and I say, don't go out from here and say, the Karaite Jew told us that this was his name. Look and see the evidence for yourself. That's key. I mean, that's a fundamental concept in my view of the world. You should see for yourself in the oracles of God and in the Hebrew Bible how his name is written and be convicted to call upon him.
Amen. Well, this is really important. And so just going into this, let's give the background on your research of this name and just that how you discovered it with just basically looking at the Aleppo Codex and when you were comparing these things. Tell this a little story of that. Let us hear it.
Okay, well, so for years it was my prayer to call on God's holy name, and I was studying at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and one of the things they taught me is we don't know his name. Or we know it's YEHOVAH, like that, of course we know. It's written 6,827 times in the Aleppo Codex, 6,828 in the Leningrad Codex. Those are two of the most important manuscripts of the Bible. The Aleppo is the most important. But I was taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and really every basic grammar of biblical Hebrew, every introduction to biblical Hebrew would tell you that the name YEHOVAH doesn't have its own vowels, it has the vowels of Adonai. This is a fact which is common knowledge, and I found out it wasn't true. Even though it was a fact that was common knowledge, right? I mean, but and how did I find out? Well, so I had this opportunity at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, an opportunity now that everybody with an internet connection has, but back then it was a special opportunity. Not everybody had access to this information, and the information I had access to were Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible. We had, I think it's called a lithographic edition, but it's a printing of a book, and every page of the book is a one-to-one photograph of different manuscripts. And actually in the early 70s and mid 70s, they did this in Jerusalem, where they put out these editions of the Aleppo Codex, of the Cairo Codex of the Prophets. They had the Leningrad Codex in very limited numbers. And like, just to give you an idea, the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, when they printed this, it was so expensive, they only made 160 copies. And at the university, and to this day, as far as I know, there's only 160 copies. And the Aleppo Codex, they made 650 copies. So originally they only sold 500. Later they found another 150 in the basement. So so in any event, so I had access to this information that there were only, I mean, it sounds like a lot. There's 160 places in the world, but they're ivory towers, they're universities. And it happened to be that my university library had all of these books. And as I was looking through them, I initially saw in the Leningrad Codex that there were in fact, the Leningrad Codex is the basis for the printed Bible that's used in seminaries and universities around the world. It's called the BHS, or the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Stuttgart is a university in Germany that put out this what's called a scholarly or academic printing based on the Leningrad Codex as its base. And I saw that there were places where, in most places, it didn't have the vowels Adonai. In fact, I was only able to ever find one place where it had something like the vowels of Adonai, and in every other place it had a shva as the first vowel and a kamatz as the last vowel. And in the rules of the Hebrew language, if you have a 4-letter word and the last letter is hey, then the hey is usually silent, like the word Torah. That's very, very common. Normally the hey at the end is silent. But what all of this meant is there was a missing vowel. And I realized, why is the missing vowel missing? Because they don't want us to pronounce it. And I got to tell you, later this was confirmed. The confirmation is that there's manuscripts that I've seen recently where there are no vowels in the name. And why are there no vowels? Because they don't want us to pronounce it, because Jewish tradition that I grew up with said Yud-He-Vav-He, the Tetragrammaton. In fact, we can't even say Yud-He-Vav-He. In the Orthodox Jewish tradition, let's say Yud-Ke-Vav-Ke, because the name is too holy even to spell out loud. Or they'll say Yud, and they have to pause. Hey, another pause. Hey, Vav, another pause. Hey, that you're allowed to do. But to actually even speak the letters is now forbidden. That's a later, much later development. But going back around 1800, 1900 years, just after the Second Temple period, there was this ban on speaking the name. And so I grew up with I never heard anybody speak the name. It was always Adonai. Whenever you see Yud-He-Vav-He, you read it as Adonai, and that's in prayer. If you're sitting and studying the Bible, even like, studying it in a class or a yeshiva, you don't say Adonai, you say Hashem. You only say Adonai when you're formally reading it from the Torah or in part of formal prayers. If you're making a blessing over an apple, then you'll say Baruch atah Adonai, shehakol niyeh bidvaro. But if you're just teaching someone that prayer, then you'll say Baruch atah Hashem. You won't even actually say Adonai. Now that's been sanctified to where it can't even be spoken. So I grew up knowing the letters of Yud-He-Vav-He, and had been taught at Hebrew University that we don't know what the vowels are. Now in my modern printed Bibles, there were printed Bibles that had no vowels. There were printed Bibles that had the vowels, various combinations of vowels. And really that was up to the whim of the printer. And that was why it was so important to go back to the manuscripts, because that was a more ancient preservation, meaning all of these printed Bibles were based in these earlier manuscripts, and I had to see how it was written in those manuscripts. And I found that there was an incomplete set of vowels, and it was my prayer for years to know what are the complete vowels. And I really felt like Moses cast out into the wilderness in the movie The Ten Commandments. He sent out into the wilderness, and Ramses says to him, I commend you to your Hebrew God who has no name. And think about that. So it's permeated into popular culture that God has no name, or at least we don't know how to pronounce it. And and there were Jews involved in making that movie, not surprisingly, the Ten Commandments. It actually says in the introduction of the full version that it's based on Jewish tradition as much as it's based on the Bible. And it's true. There's midrashim that are incorporated into the story that aren't anywhere in the Tanakh, in the Torah.
Yeah.
So in any event, that's a good movie. I watch it every Passover. I love it. But it is based on legend as much as it's based on scripture. So so there I was looking for the praying. And you have to understand. So I'm at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at the time, working on my bachelor's and my master's degree, and I have access to probably the best library in the world for biblical studies and Judaic studies. I mean, I have book after book I'm reading, and article after article in these academic journals. I read voraciously every single thing I could find that was written on the name. I read it. And what I found is people made really good arguments. There was the argument the name was Yahweh, based on Pharaoh, Paro. There was the argument that the name was Yahweh, based on a Greek quoting a Samaritan. That wasn't so impressive. There were a whole bunch of arguments about what the name was. And I'm like, they have, he's got his opinions. They've got their opinions. I don't know. I mean, how am I supposed to ever know what your true name is, was my prayer. And my prayer was, I don't want man's opinion. I want to see it in the Bible for myself. That was my prayer. I want to see it in black and white. And even if that's not the true name, at least when I stand before you in the day of judgment, I'll be able to say, hey, it was in the Bible. It was in the oracles of God preserved by the ancient Hebrew scribes. And so there I was minding my own business, and I had a job. This was during my master's degree by this time. And my job was proofreading the Aleppo Codex. And more specifically, I had a stack of photographs in one hand of the Aleppo Codex 1-to-1 that was based on the printing from the mid-70s. What they'd actually done is they disassembled it. They cut out the the beautiful binding, and so they had like these loose photographs. And the other side, I had a stack of printed pages, and I was checking every jot and tittle, every dot and dash. That was my job, really, to the level of precision that was, I mean, we'd call it today OCD. I don't know that anybody knew that term back then. If there was a circle over one of the letters that represented a note in the margin, the circle had to be placed, I don't know, above the gimel and not to the slight left of the gimel. And if it was in the wrong place, I had to make a notation and have it corrected in the printed edition. I mean, it was very tedious. I loved every minute of it. So there I am checking every jot and tittle, and I was in Ezekiel, and I come across the place where all of a sudden it says, Baruch kavod YEHOVAH min komo. Blessed is the glory of YEHOVAH from his place. And YEHOVAH has the full vowels. And the vowels are YEHOVAH. And up until then, I'd always read Yeh. There's an Hey with no vowel, and then Va. And I don't know what that missing vowel is. And just at that moment, I get a phone call. I've shared this story on a number of occasions. And I get this phone call, and a plane just flew into the Twin Towers. And at the time, my immediate response was, well, some kind of fluke. That's an accident. Put down the phone, and I'm thinking maybe this is a fluke too. Maybe a drop of ink fell or something. And I say, I need to know. Like, I have this burning need right now to know, is this really his name? And it made sense, because you have names throughout the Hebrew language that begin Yeho and end Yahu. And there's a grammatical reason for that. I learned at Hebrew University. It's called pretonal shortening. And basically what happens is, in Hebrew, the accent, meaning the emphasized syllable, and I say syllable to be funny, because we know it's syllable and not syllable. So in Hebrew, the emphasized syllable is always the last syllable or the second to last syllable. And it's very common that when a word or when a syllable is close to the emphasized syllable, it'll have a long vowel. And I hope this isn't too technical for people. And as it becomes distanced from the emphasized syllable, the vowel is shortened. And the daily example from Hebrew speech is the word gadol, which has a kamatz under the gimel. It means big. And when you say the plural form, it's gedolim. When you're talking about more than one big thing. And the kamatz turns into a shva. And there's countless examples from the Hebrew language. My contact lens is bothering me. Sorry. So there's countless examples from the Hebrew language where this happens, and like I said, it has a name, pretonal shortening, sometimes pre-pretonal shortening. Basically, as it's distanced, And so that was my gut thought, like, okay, wow. So this fits the concept of pretonal shortening. And a name like Eliyahu, the emphasis is on the syllable with the kamatz, Eliyahu. And my name, properly, people call me Nehemia. That's actually an Eastern European pronunciation of my name. The proper Hebrew, undisputable, my name is Nehemiah. And I only had one professor who ever called me Nehemiah. He was, a stickler for biblical Hebrew. And why is it Yah and not Nehemiah? Because Yah is the emphasized syllable. It has to be Yah. But then you take that Yah and you put it at the beginning of the name, and at the beginning of my name, it would be Yehonachem. And Yehonachem, it couldn't be, I can't say it couldn't be. It wouldn't normally be Yahunachem. That's just not how Hebrew works. That would be very awkward. Because the emphasized syllable is so far from the syllable from that yud, which is the yud of YEHOVAH, the Yahu becomes Yeho. And that kind of is very intuitive and makes perfect sense to somebody who has studied proper biblical Hebrew. If you're just a Hebrew speaker, you might not know what the rules are. But as you learn the rules of grammar and how the language is structured, that's just obvious. Okay, so there I am, and I put aside my work, which is and I have to admit, I wasn't a very good worker. I was being paid to do this job. And I put it aside, and I say, my job is to check every jot and tittle. It'll take me an hour to read one page. I don't have an hour. I need to know now. Is this a mistake or not? I'm burning inside to know. And I put it aside, and I say, I'm just going to skim the pages looking for the name. And I got to tell you, back then I had much better vision than I do now. So I start skimming, and I go page after page, and I keep finding YEHOVAH with the missing vowel. And it's like torturing me, like, so it was just that one place. I'm like Gideon, I need a second witness. So I start, going page after page after page. About 15 minutes later, I find a second instance where YEHOVAH has the full vowels. And I look at that and I say, okay, second witness. This isn't a fluke. And I get the second phone call. The second plane had flown into the Twin Towers. And I'm like, that's not a fluke, and this is not a fluke. This is truly God's name. Now, Joseph, I got to tell you, I'm one of these people. You ever hear the expression that someone could miss the forest for the trees? You're looking at the trees and you miss that you're looking at a forest. I'm not that guy. I'm the guy who misses the trees in the forest because I'm looking at the leaves under a microscope, and I'm looking at the mitochondria in the cells. That's me. I'm a detail guy very often. My brain tends to work that way. So I didn't fully realize the significance of this until I was talking to a friend on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and he says to me, do you realize at that very moment that you discovered the name in the Aleppo Codex in two places, just as that was happening, thousands of miles across the world, there were people who were flying planes into building and shouting out the name of their God, because that's what they do when they wreak havoc and terror. They shout the name of their God. And at that moment, the creator of the universe, maybe he wanted his name to be known. And I'm like, wow, like that was in front of me for 10 years and I missed it. That's me, It's one of those things that, afterwards you're like, oh yeah, that was obvious. How come I didn't see it? But anyway, so that's how I discovered it. At the time, I knew of two manuscripts. That was my second witness in the second manuscript. The first one, I'm sure, was just one quirky scribe, right? But now it's two scribes, two manuscripts, and the most important manuscript in the world. It's in the Israel Museum alongside the Shrine of the Book. That's how important the Aleppo Codex is considered. And I said, okay, this is not a fluke. This really is his name. And but I'm going up against a scholarly bulwark of consensus. And the scholarly bulwark of consensus is this Yahweh. Every university professor, every seminary student knows it's Yahweh. Why? Because it says it in Gesenius's grammar. And without Gesenius's grammar, we're lost, right? That's the definitive grammar of biblical Hebrew, written by a German Christian in the 1800s. Later, I come to find out he gives two sources. I didn't know this at the time. Do we want to go into this, or is this you want to?
Hey, no, this is actually really great, because this is some of the information that rocked my, if what you're about to talk about, if I wouldn't have seen this, it wouldn't have been so it wouldn't have been so black and white for me, because go ahead, my brother.
So I had read somebody suggest this, and I thought that's some conspiracy theory. Come on, and this happens a lot, that there'll be a word in one language and it'll sound like a word in another language, and people who don't know languages, and especially people who don't know Hebrew, will say, "Oh, God is the word in English for Elohim, but then there is a Canaanite deity named God, and therefore when you say God in English, you're actually calling upon the Canaanite deity." I mean, I'm sure that, there's so many languages in the world. I could say the word, coffee, and I'm sure there's some language where that's the name of a god. I guarantee you. I mean, I'd be shocked if that were not the case. Just in India alone, there's over 500 languages. So the fact that there's a word in one language that's the name of a deity, a pagan deity, that means nothing to me. I don't speak those languages. I'm speaking English and I speak Hebrew, and I get people, I call them the word police. They'll come to me and say, you shouldn't say Wednesday because Wednesday is the day of Odin. And that actually happens to be true, that Woden's day is the Norse god. But I say, okay, what do you want me to do? I could talk to you in Hebrew, and then I'll say Yom Revi'i, fourth day. But if we're talking English, it's called Wednesday. If you want to get the whole English world to agree and changing it to fourth day, I got no problem with that. But until then, the whole purpose of language is that we're able to communicate. So if I have some term that nobody else knows, what it means, well, what good is that? So in any event, so going back to this, so I had heard this conspiracy theory, thought this is, that doesn't mean, I don't care. I don't know. That doesn't mean, there's no evidence for that. And what I'm referring to is that Gesenius gives two main reasons in his early work about where later he backtracks from this, but in his early work, you could see it's almost like, like later he's like, okay, we've got to polish this and get rid of our, we don't want to show our work like in mathematics, right? We're just going to show the result. But you can see his work in the earlier version of his. He actually wrote a lexicon, which became the basis for Brown Driver Briggs, which is the standard, up until recently, certainly was the standard lexicon of biblical Hebrew. What they often don't tell you have to read the introduction, is Brown. So what happened is Driver expanded on what Brown did, and Briggs expanded what on Driver did. So it's called Brown Driver Briggs. But Brown expanded on what Gesenius did in his German lexicon. So it should actually be called Gesenius Brown Driver Briggs, but they don't call it that. So in his early lexicon, he explains two reasons for saying Yahweh. And if you have to look really far back to find out what his real reason is, the real reason is that YEHOVAH in Hebrew, they hypothesized, the people who advocated that pronunciation, we're talking like the early 1800s. They said, well, that in Hebrew should mean he that causes to be. And what is the name of the creator God? It should be creator, right? And we have YEHOVAH. We don't know what the vowels are because all we have are the vowels of Adonai, or so it's claimed. And by the way, Adonai is an ah. And in the manuscripts, there's not an ah, there's an eh in that place. So YEHOVAH is the vowels when it has the full vowels, which again is very rare. Normally there's a missing vowel, but even when there's a missing vowel, there's no ah there, there's an eh. It should be obvious. Those aren't the vowels of Adonai. It should have been obvious to me too, but it wasn't. I'm being told by these people who are supposed to be much smarter than me that those are the vowels of Adonai. Anyway, so back to Gesenius, this German Christian in the early 1800s. So he says that one of the sources we have for the pronunciation, of course, the background of all this is we know it means he that causes to be. In Hebrew, that's YEHOVAH. And I should point out that that's a hypothetical form of the Hebrew verb to be that's never been found in biblical Hebrew, at least. So it's a fictitious form that these German scholars invented, these Christian European scholars. They invented what they wanted the name to be. They created that grammatical form to fit it. So in any event, so going back to his two main arguments in his lexicon, one is that, well, there's a Christian named Theodoret of Cyrus who says the Jews pronounce the Tetragrammaton Ayah, and the Samaritans pronounce it Yahweh. Okay, well, Yahweh is nothing in Hebrew. That can't be the name. So if we back translate Yahweh into Hebrew, then it could be YEHOVAH. It's possible because Greek doesn't have a hey. There's no H sound in Greek, right? So YEHOVAH could be transcribed as a Greek as Yahweh. And by the way, that shows in this period, if that's true, that the Vav was pronounced as a V. Now there's a W. That's a different discussion. But that's a Samaritan pronunciation. And later I found out that the Samaritans didn't even pronounce the name. So, and there's evidence for that from, for example, from Josephus, that the Samaritans, going back to 330 or so BCE, they refer to their God as the God who is anonymous, who has no name. That's at least one that's spoken. So this is a Christian quoting a Samaritan who didn't even speak the name, and we're talking like in the 400s AD. Well, wait a minute. Even if it is a Samaritan who spoke the name, the Samaritans are Gentiles who were brought from Babylon, who then learned about the God of Israel from a wicked priest from the high places. Why would I listen to them? When it, and the Jews, they're telling us pronounce it differently. Ayah. Well, what's Ayah? Ayah can be one of two things. Eheyeh, which is Exodus 3:14, I will be. But more likely it's just Yah, as in hallelujah. And remember that Yah and hallelujah, that the emphasis is on the Yah. If you take those same two letters, Yud Hey, and then add the Vav and put it at the beginning, it should be a Shva, Yeho. That's the pretonal shortening concept.
Right.
Anyway, so one of these sources he brings is a Christian quoting a Samaritan. The Christian's writing in Greek. I hope this isn't too technical. And the other one he brings blew me away when I saw it. I said, this can't be true. He can't be saying this. And what Gesenius says sometime in the 1830s, I believe it is he says that, and I have a whole study on my website. I'm not doing this justice. It's called something like, Are You Praying to Jupiter? And it's on nehemiaswall.com, nehemiaswall.com. And it turns out, he says, well, the ancient Greeks had a god named Jupiter. And that god Jupiter wasn't called Jupiter. He was called Yahweh, because in ancient Latin, Jupiter is actually Yahweh Pater, which is Father Yahweh. What? And so Yahweh, he says, must come from the same source as the God of the Hebrews, and therefore, based on what we know from Latin, because in Latin we know the vowels, in Hebrew we don't, argues Gesenius. Since in Latin it's Yahweh, in Hebrew it must be Yahweh. And he argues that the Latins got the name of their God from some ancient Egyptian source, and the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt got the name of their God from the same place. And so therefore, of course, Yahweh wouldn't be a Hebrew form, so it would be Yahweh. And, oh boy. And I realized then and there, okay, so this conspiracy theory, I mean, that's a smoking gun. It's not a conspiracy theory. He's telling us that Yahweh, he's the main source, the main academic source for arguing that the name is Yahweh, is saying that, well, Jupiter, that proves it, because it's Yahweh Pater, Father Yahweh. I mean, whoa.
This is incredible. And Nehemia, I just have to say, anyone who is questioning this, please go to nehemiaswall.com and support his ministry and be able to get access to this study. Because if you've been calling on Yahweh, and Nehemia brings us out that we'll get into Psalms 44 here in a minute, but this is so heavy, and this evidence is really heavy. And me personally, being someone who loves the Father so much and wants to be walking in truth, this destroyed me in a sense. And for a moment when I heard this study, I was like, I'm going to listen to Nehemia's study on Are We Praying to Jupiter? I thought it was going to be like the lunar Sabbath one or something that you're reasoning about. And I'm driving down the road and I'm listening to this, and I'm like, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Then I could tell where you're going with it, and the evidence was so solid. But I looked up everything that you said and went to every single.
Don't take my word for it. Just check the sources.
Yeah, every single source. And I looked, and it's 100%. And I know that your friend Michael Rood also changed his pronunciation at some point. I don't know if it was based on that, but based on the accurate YEHOVAH.
Actually, when he changed it, I didn't even know about that. I learned about that later. I didn't even know that myself. So that was much later. He changed it much earlier than that. Yeah. And
you have, your Open Door series. I think this information came after that, because you were bringing out that, some people say Yahweh.
And still, I want to say, if somebody feels convicted, they have searched the best they are able to, and they're convinced that the name is Yahweh based on the best information they have. Who am I to say they shouldn't pronounce it? But please look at the information. And Joseph, I'm going to do something that that I might get in trouble for, but you know, I have this study, Are You Praying to Jupiter, on my website. It's in something I call the support team studies. Those are studies that I record just for people who support my ministry as a way of saying thank you. But I am going to make this available to the public. Once you put out this interview, I'm going to make it available to the public for, I don't know, a week or two, because I think this is so important that those who are yearning for this information get it. And so I am going to make this available. It just needs to be heard. Please, guys, go and listen to this. You know, it's a limited time, you know, whatever. I'm going to make it available for a limited time where you could just go and listen to it. And because it really is important. I think, you know, there's this academic consensus, but when you peel away the layers of the onion, you peel off the mask of the what's that cliche from the movie, of the Matrix. No, the Matrix. Okay. You're peeling off the, you know, this mask of the Matrix, where you realize, oh, all these scholars, they all agree it's Yahweh. It says it in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, here's where they got it from. They got it from the guy who says, well, the Hebrews had the same God as the ancient Latins, and they worship Yahweh Pater. And I had to call up several different scholars who are experts in Latin, because I'm not an expert in Latin. And I said, is this true? And they're like, well, yeah. And I said, well, no, but surely in ancient Latin, it's written as a V. It was Yahweh. They're like, no, in ancient Latin, it was a W. And I'm like, wow. It was a W that became a V in later Latin. In early Latin, it was a W. And so it actually is Yahweh. And there's no question that in ancient Latin, Yahweh and Yahweh are virtually, I mean, obviously it's a slightly different pronunciation, but it's virtually indistinguishable. And there are definitely people who, you know, that's the sort. Now, if you feel convicted to call his name as Yahweh, you know, after you search the evidence, then you know what, and we're going to talk about Psalm 44. I think our God is that merciful. I really do. And I shouldn't be your judge. If he's that merciful, how dare I judge my brother? So I'll go with people, and I'll, you know, they look at the letters YEHOVAH, and they, to the best of their knowledge, believe those are Yahweh. Okay, I'm not going to judge you, but at least know where it comes from the consensus of wonderful scholars who argue that it's Yahweh. At least know where they're getting it from, you know.
Right. And so this is interesting, because I saw this for years also as a conspiracy theory, and there were all these people, you know, we see all this stuff online putting out all of these.
There's a lot of wacky things. And by the way, you mentioned something about lunar Sabbath. Just to be clear, I'm not a lunar Sabbatarian. I keep the Jewish Sabbath, which is commanded in the Torah, which is every 7 days, and has nothing to do with the moon. Okay, just to be clear on that.
Okay, yeah, me too. I keep the Jewish Sabbath, and we follow the Torah.
Which is God's Sabbath. It's the Sabbath of YEHOVAH. You call it the Sabbath of Yahweh, if that's how you think. Yeah. So let's
go to this breakdown of Psalms 44, verse 20 and 21. So that as we're on this subject, before we move on, because it's so it is beautiful, and your heart, the way you share this information is very important. And brothers and sisters, just saying for me, who was able to look at this and actually change and understand that all my prayers, when I was praying, vocalizing the Tetragrammaton is Yahweh. I know he heard my prayers. I've seen him working in my life. I know for sure.
Isn't he amazing?
Hallelujah.
He's
yeah.
He's that merciful.
Amazing.
He's much more merciful than we are. By the way, I appreciate that you say Yahweh and not Yahweh, because in Hebrew, the one thing that's indisputable is that in the name, the accent is on the final syllable, whatever that final syllable is. So when you say Yahweh, I mean, that's completely the Latin pronunciation.
Right.
Because Latin tends to have the syllable on anyway, I'm not a Latin expert. Let's move on. All right. So, but yeah, it's definitely not a Hebraic sound when you say Yahweh. It's my way or it's Yahweh. I mean, that just doesn't sound Hebrew. You know, what's interesting is you could go to Israel and say to any rabbi Yahweh, he will have no idea what you're talking about. If you say YEHOVAH, he will yell at you and tell you, don't say that name. It's too holy. Get out of here. He might not say get out of here, but he'll immediately recognize that that's the name. And it's funny. I put out, it's not even funny. I put out this book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. And I've discussed this with rabbis who unfortunately won't go on the record, which, you know, you'd expect. And they'll say, so you put out a book proving the sky is blue, that the name, you know, the name is, and they won't say it, but they'll, you know, meaning I'll tell them the name is YEHOVAH. They'll be like, no, duh, Sherlock. Of course it's, you know, of course that's it. You know, and sometimes they'll say Yeho, and then they'll pause, Va. Like I've had rabbis, one rabbi do that. because they can't say the name. It's forbidden by tradition. But obviously that's it. And I have never to this day met a rabbi who said the name is Yahweh. Maybe there are some. I'm sure there might be some at Bar Ilan University, which is, an academic institution based on Gesenius, who will say, well, and you ask them, what's the source? Do you have Jewish sources that it's Yahweh? Well, no, Gesenius says that, and he has good arguments. Okay, whatever.
Right.
There's no Jew. I've never found a Jewish source, an ancient Jewish source, a medieval Jewish source that said it's Yahweh. I have found Jewish sources that say it's YEHOVAH. In fact, I'm working on a study right now where I've uncovered 16 rabbis who say it's YEHOVAH, which is pretty cool. In writing, meaning like if you go to a rabbi today and say, I want to get you in a recording saying it's YEHOVAH, they probably won't do it. But these were rabbis who were writing to each other. And there's one letter I found where the rabbi is writing to the other rabbi, and he says, hide this in a pure and holy place. And he explains that things like this shouldn't be made public. They shouldn't even be printed. They should only be written in writing, lest the unworthy, meaning us, use them and find out that his name is YEHOVAH, which is pretty amazing. It's a smoking gun. All right, Psalm 44. I want to start in verse 2. We're not going to read the whole thing, or not verse 2. Where's the section here? Because I want to get the concept here, or the context here. It's describing Israel as in the exile. And let's see. You have saved us from our foes, verse 7. Yeah, well, 2021 is what we want to get to, but I want to get the context of 20 and 21. Here. So verse 9 in the English, 10 in the Hebrew, it says, you have rejected us and abased us, and have not gone out with our armies. You made us turn back from the foe, and our enemies have gotten spoil. I'm reading here the NRSV. You have made us like sheep for slaughter and have scattered us among the nations. You have sold your people for a trifle, demanding no high price for them. So what are they describing? These are Jews in the exile who are saying this. And they've been taken as prisoners by a foreign army and literally sold as slaves, which happened. So these are the exiles. You have made us the taunt of our neighbors. Who are these neighbors? Probably they're the neighbors in Babylon who see these Jews come and move into their neighborhood and say, "Oh, you're those Jews who were defeated by our mighty king, our mighty emperor, and you're now second-class citizen slaves." The derision and scorn of those around us. You have made us a byword among the nation, a laughingstock among the peoples. This is exile. This is not Israel in its glory under the time of David. These are the Jews in the exile. Now that we understand the concept, let's go to verse 17 in the English, verse 18 in the Hebrew. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from you. Yet you have broken us in the haunt of jackals. And the Tanakh haunt of jackals is an image of a place that's like abandoned, meaning it's a ruin. We have jackals in Israel that they tend to go in places where there's like old buildings and stuff like that that are abandoned, and covered us with deep darkness. And then they say, this is the key part, verses 20 to 21, 21 to 22 in the Hebrew. If we had forgotten the name of our God, and we didn't forget, but if we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to a strange God, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. So what is it talking about here? They're talking about, look, we're in exile, and you're so merciful. Even if we called on the name of Baal, because in exile, we've forgotten our language, some of us. They were in exile for 70 years, and some of them remained in exile. Only 10% went back after the exile ended. And over time, they forgot how to speak Hebrew. They were speaking Aramaic, and I'm sure the ones in Persia were speaking Persian. So they're speaking these foreign tongues. They're surrounded by who are worshiping idols, and they're saying, if we had forgotten the name of our God and spread out our hands, that's an act of supplication. You spread out your hands in prayer in the Tanakh. We spread out our hands to a foreign God. You'd look inside our heart and you'd know that we were true. For he knows the secrets of the heart, it says, ta'alumot lev, literally the hidden things of the heart. And what is the hidden thing of the heart in this case? The hidden things is when we're in exile and we're calling out to Marduk and to Baal, you know that we mean you, because it's the best we can do with what we have. He's that merciful. He's far more merciful than we are. We meet people, and look, I'm not, so innocent. I'll interact with people, and I'm so much better than the Hindu who worships Krishna. Look how wonderful and smart and righteous I am, right? But if that Hindu who doesn't know any better and thinks he's calling upon the one true God, thinks he's calling upon the God who created heaven and earth, the God who made the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the true creator who appeared to 600,000 Israelite men and maybe 2 to 3 million women and children at Mount Sinai, if he, in the best of his knowledge, he can call that God a false name, God is going to look in that man's heart and have mercy on that person. And what are we talking about here? We're not talking about calling on Krishna. We're talking about, do I pronounce it YEHOVAH or YEHOVAH or Yahuwah or Yahweh or YOHOWOHO or YUHUVUHU? And I've said in the past YUHUVUHU as a joke. I actually found that in writing in one Jewish source. So there's more Jewish support from Hebrew sources for YUHUVUHU than there is for Yahweh. But in any event, if someone to the best of his knowledge, a Kabbalist, calls on YUHUVUHU, I believe God will look in that person's heart and accept that prayer. I think that's what Psalms is saying. And if you understand it differently, please explain it. I don't know how else to read it. He's that merciful.
Hallelujah. Yeah, this is so beautiful.
Isn't he amazing?
So amazing. Yeah, so amazing. And you're right. We, people that have knowledge of the scriptures and are doing their best to follow him, there you find that there's a serious lack of compassion and lack of just mercy,
humility,
and especially amongst this Hebrew roots movement and what that's so-called Hebrew roots movement and the Paleo Hebrew movement. I've put up a video yesterday called there was a V in the ancient, a V sound in the ancient, or was there an ancient V in the a V sound in the ancient Hebrew? And I said, even if you think the Vav is Wah, there still was you bring this out. There's the vet and the vet. There still is a V sound, and I mean, here it goes off the chart. People are upset. And
that you're saying the letter bet is pronounced Va.
Yeah,
I mean, I had an exchange with one gentleman, and I'd put out a study called "Wow, It's a Vav." That's also on my website, nehemiaswall.com. And this one person, he writes to me. He says, "How dare you teach people that it's a V, not a W? We've done years of research to prove that it's W." And I said, "Okay, can you share me some of your sources?" He ends up writing back, well, it's in the encyclopedia such and such, and literally Wikipedia was one of his sources, which I could go onto Wikipedia right now and I could literally. In fact, I want someone to do this just to show that it can be done. It might be changed back, but you could literally anonymously go on and change that V to say in early Hebrew, the V was originally pronounced K. You could literally do that. Anybody can change it. Now, somebody might change it back, but there's no staff that are, as far as I know, that is preventing just some random person from going to a Starbucks. And by the way, I'm not saying go mess up Wikipedia. Don't actually do that. I'm kidding around. But literally anybody could go in. I don't even think in the past you didn't even have to log in. I had somebody who, anyway, it's crazy. You can literally, so that's not really a source Wikipedia. That's somebody's opinion out there, and you don't even know whose opinion, right? At least if you say the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's someone's opinion, and you could say, oh, the name of the person who wrote that is, Jim Smith, right? Well, here you don't even know whose opinion it is on Wikipedia. So, and I get this all the time. People who say, I thought you know Hebrew. Don't you know there's no V sound in Hebrew? That comes from the Ashkenazim speaking Yiddish. Has nothing to do with it. The one thing every Jewish community agrees throughout history is that there's a V sound in the Hebrew, and that's specifically related to the letter bet. When there's a dot in it, it's B. When there's no dot, it's V. And again, this is me proving the sky is blue. It's like with my book, Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence, where rabbis say to me, why do you need a whole book to say his name is YEHOVAH? We know that his name is YEHOVAH, right? Well, the scholars at Hebrew University told me it's not. That's why I needed the book, right? I'm proving the sky is blue because there's people who say the sky is orange, and I'm an idiot. I'm colorblind because I think it's blue. No, it turns out it is blue. And it's the same thing with the V. With the V, I went into this saying, I don't know, is it YEHOVAH or YEHOWAH? I don't have a skin in the game, right? I don't know what it is. Let's, many Jewish scholars will tell you it's originally a W. This isn't a Jewish, non-Jewish thing. Many Jewish scholars will tell you it's a W. And I looked at the evidence, and the evidence I found is actually the W very likely comes from Arabic, not from Hebrew. And they can go watch your video, and I have an audio study or video I think I have on this on nehemiaswall.com. It's pretty compelling evidence. I don't know how you can, once you look at the evidence, what you can say without any question whatsoever that in Second Temple period they pronounced it as a vav. That's not even a dispute. The question is, does it go back before then? And people will say, well, Second Temple, that's, the first century AD. We go back to the Paleo-Hebrew. Based on what? You have a recording of Paleo-Hebrew? You have evidence from how Paleo-Hebrew is pronounced? Or you just read that on Wikipedia or someone's opinion? Right? The evidence is that what comes in from Arabic, Anyway, and maybe it's earlier, but show me the evidence.
And this is really important that you bring this up. And so I had done your study on Are We Praying to Jupiter? I had seen a lot of evidence, and I was at this point, but I was willing to look at this, and I was open that the pronunciation was the way you were saying it, but it wasn't proven to me that the vav was a vav and it wasn't a wav, because this stuff is ingrained in us. I mean, it's in so many books, and being, coming from my tradition and where I came from, it's like wa is the ancient. And so I was driving on the road, and I thought to myself, there's a scripture in the New Testament that says, that basically the scriptures are you're supposed to base for setting doctrine and reproof, so the man of Elohim could be set everything correct. Basically it talks about in 2 Timothy that we should use the scriptures to actually prove our understanding of all things. So I said, man, if we could understand this in the scriptures, then if I could see the vav in the Tanakh, then I would know for sure. And then about a week later, you put up, wow, it's a vav study, and I watched it, and I was like, Nehemia did it. He showed me in the Tanakh. And it's not, brother, there was a wonderful study. And also this amazingness that the book of Ezekiel was where you first discovered the vowel point. And then you take us to the book of Ezekiel.
Oh yeah, that's true.
For Gav. It's incredible. And for me, that was, and you bring out so much more than that, but the fact that it's in the Tanakh, and whether it was also a wow, and so in other dialects or whatever, we know for sure that the vav goes to the Tanakh. And I don't want to base my understanding on theories or what could have been. And so this is good enough evidence for me. And I really, and so I'd like to actually take this moment to for you to share a little bit about with the audience about just Hebrew in general, because what a lot of people don't understand is that even though for the most part, at some point, Hebrew was lost in daily speech, it wasn't lost in the shuls and the synagogues and in the prayer language. And so if you could give us a little history about the Hebrew language.
For sure. Okay. And before I do that, though, I kind of started a point and got on a tangent. And my point was that, if what I really want to encourage people out there is, if your brother who's standing next to you in the pews, or who you're studying with or whatever, says Yahuwah or Yahweh, please don't slap his hand. Don't jump down his throat and rebuke him, because that's not what it's about. In love, say, hey, there is this other evidence, would you be willing to look at it? And if he's not, that is still between him and the creator of the universe. So this isn't about, we now have the truth, let's go correct everybody. That I really, that's not what it's about. It shouldn't be about that. It should be about, you have a relationship with the creator of the universe. You're doing your best to call upon him, and your brother, let's not second guess him. He's doing his best too. You want to share information with him? Great. If he's willing to look at it, great. And if not, don't judge him. That's between him and the creator of the universe. The worst thing you can do is go, they've actually proven this in scientific studies, it turns out. I just read about this, that if you go and you show somebody evidence that proves definitively that they're wrong on something, that it sometimes will actually, it's called the blowback effect. It'll cause them to be even deeper entrenched in their opinion, rather than say, oh, okay, the evidence proved I'm wrong, let's change. A lot of people will just get more deeply entrenched. They find this in politics particularly. And look, so even before I knew about that, I was telling people, don't go slap your brother's hand. And by the way, that's a metaphor I learned from Keith. Keith met this gentleman, I think his name was Chet, and he wrote with his right hand, and it was really sloppy. And it turned out that he was a lefty, and he was a kid. People would, his teachers would slap his hand whenever he wrote with the left hand. So he learned to write with the right, and he never wrote, and one day his dad says to him, just write with your left hand. And so don't go slap your brother's hand, in Hebrew is a left-hand language. It goes from left to right. So the Hebrew language, there's this common misconception that the Hebrew language was dead for 2,000 years and no one knew how to pronounce it. That's just not true. Now let me give you a parallel. So there was a language called Ancient Egyptian. I guess they didn't call it Ancient Egyptian in Ancient Egypt. They just called it Egyptian. And it's written in hieroglyphs. And we didn't know how to read hieroglyphs until somebody came along with the Rosetta Stone. And what they did with the Rosetta Stone, it had 3 languages. One of them was hieroglyphics. Another was something called Demotic. And the third was Greek. And they said, well, we know how to pronounce Greek, more or less. At least we know what Greek means. And using the Rosetta Stone, they deciphered this previously dead language. Hebrew is not like that at all. There have always been Jews who read Hebrew, who wrote in Hebrew, who could speak Hebrew on a basic level, but more as a scholarly language, meaning when Hebrew became a dead language, you still had scholars who could speak to each other in Hebrew. When a Jew came from Europe and met a Jew in a Sephardic country, like let's say Egypt, they couldn't speak. The Jews in European countries mostly spoke Yiddish, which is a dialect of German with about 5 to 10% Hebrew mixed in with it. And then the Jews in North Africa and in the Middle East spoke Arabic. So a Jew would come from Europe, he couldn't speak Arabic, they'd speak to each other in Hebrew. That was always the language of scholars. So if a rabbi wrote, he usually wrote in Hebrew because he wanted the Sephardic Jews to read it. And a Sephardic rabbi usually would write in Hebrew because he wanted the Ashkenazic Jews to be able to read it. If he wrote in Arabic, they would, only his countrymen could read it. So Hebrew was always the international language of Jews. And you could be a Jew and you could go to almost any country with a few exceptions. And one of those exceptions, for example, Ethiopia, where they didn't preserve Hebrew. But in most countries, you could go anywhere from Morocco to Lithuania, to Amsterdam, to Yemen. And if you were a rabbi, you could communicate with another Jew in Hebrew, another rabbi in Hebrew. It was the internet. Yeah. You could write letters, and we have letters like this. We have letters from Jews in southern France who spoke French, Old French, and they wrote letters to rabbis in Egypt who didn't know a word of French. And what did they write? They wrote in Hebrew because that was the language.
Wow.
So Hebrew was all, and we actually have those letters found in the Cairo Geniza. We have a letter that was written to Maimonides. And it's very interesting because we have the response of Maimonides in the 12th century where he gives his daily schedule. He says, look, if you came here, I'd be too busy to meet you because I work all day as a doctor and I only have time to study on the weekends and I don't have time to talk to people. I'm so busy with my studies. It's an amazing letter. And it's written in Hebrew because Hebrew is the international language of Jews always. One of the things I only learned recently is that in starting in the 1860s, the Jews of Europe had a daily newspaper in Hebrew. First it was weekly and then it became daily. And it was in Hebrew, which is incredible because you had women, not just scholars, but you had women who, you normally didn't have like a yeshiva education who were reading in this newspaper. And who are even mentioned in the newspaper. You had people who were just like everyday workers who could read Hebrew. They might not be able to speak Hebrew. That took a little bit more level. So the point is you always had people who could read and write Hebrew. And so the pronunciation of Hebrew was never lost. So when we say that it's a w and not we, when scholars say it's a w, where do they get that from? And more importantly, how do we know that the Hebrew letter gimel is a g? Right? Maybe gimel is really a p. How do we know? So the answer is in the 1800s, you had these scholars in Germany who wanted to write a grammar of Hebrew. And they said, look, up until now, we only knew Hebrew from the Jews of Europe. Let's go to all the Jews in the world and ask them how to pronounce these different letters. And they did that. They went to Jews in Yemen, they went to Jews in Iraq and the Jews in Morocco, or at least they claimed they did. I don't know if they actually did. And they documented that, okay, every Jewish community in the world pronounces a gimel with a dot as a g. But what about a gimel without a dot? So the Jews of Europe pronounce it as a g. And they say originally we pronounced it differently, but we've kind of lost that pronunciation. Well, what was it pronounced like before that? I don't know if you know this, but originally the gimel without a dot was pronounced by some Jewish communities as a ra, which is a guttural sound, similar to the Arabic ghain.
Okay.
And in fact, in Arabic countries, it was a ghain. And other countries, it was pronounced as a j. So when it came to the letter vav, you had Jews, and those are specifically 6 letters, beged, kefet, that are pronounced one way with a dot and one way without a dot. With a dot, the letter bet is pronounced as a b. Without a dot, it's a v. With a dot, letter gimel is pronounced as a g. Without a dot, it's a j. Letter daled, with a dot, it's a d. Without a dot, it's a the. Now, I grew up pronouncing both of them as a d. But we were taught, yeah, originally we pronounced it differently, but we don't do that anymore. But there were Jews who preserved the as the pronunciation of Daled. And in fact, there's a tradition when you read the Shema, you have to emphasize the duh in, here, let me pull it up right now. Now that I have this in front of me. So this is Deuteronomy 6:4. And this is a tradition I grew up not understanding, because in my pronunciation of European Jewry, we didn't have this distinction between duh and the. So it says, Shema Yisrael, Yehovah Eloheinu, Yehovah Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yehovah is our God, and Yehovah is one. And the tradition says, emphasize the Daled of Echad. And so my father used to read this. He put his hands on his eyes, the tradition, and he would say, Shema Yisrael. That's how my father sounded. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. But he didn't know, or he didn't maybe care, that originally the issue there is that it was the, and they were emphasizing that it was a the. Okay, wow. So that's a Daled. We said Beged Kefet, Bet Gimel Daled, and this is not a matter of dispute. How to pronounce it exactly as a the or a za, that might be a matter of dispute. But that the Daled with a dot and without a dot is pronounced two different ways. That's not a matter of dispute. Kefet is Kaf Pei Tav. Ka, and this is still distinguished by at least Ashkenazic Jews. The dot with the kaf with a dot is a ka, without a dot it's a cha. The pei with a dot is a pa, without a dot it's a fa. And the tav with a dot is a ta, without it Ashkenazim say sa, and Yemenite Jews say tha. But it's some sound like a sa or a tha. And that's not even a matter of dispute. This is fact that everyone accepts. In this case, common knowledge, I don't know if it's common knowledge actually, but every Jew who learns Hebrew grammar knows with a dot it's one day and without a dot. You learn this in kindergarten, right? Yeah. Now in modern Israel, they don't say the ta without a dot is a sa or a tha. They just say ta for both. So that's why an Israeli will say Shabbat, and an Ashkenazic Jew in America will say Shabbos. Where does it get the sa of Shabbos? It's the ta without the dot. And you can't say Shabbos is wrong. It's just a different dialect of Hebrew, right? It's not wrong. Right. Is it wrong to say, Americans say government? At least I say government growing up in Chicago. A British person will say government, right? Is government wrong? Well, no. It's just a different dialect of English, right? You know what they're talking about, and I'm sure there's places in England that I can't understand half of what they say. I used to watch in Israel. We had very little on television, and back when I watched television, and there was this police drama that took place in some like Northumbria, and there were Hebrew subtitles because it was in Israel, and I couldn't understand them. I have to read the Hebrew subtitles. I literally couldn't understand what they were saying in English. Wow. and read the Hebrew subtitles in this old police drama. It was like in the 90s, before cable and stuff like that. So the point is that in Hebrew, every Jewish community agrees that the bet with a dot is a ba, and without a dot it's a va. That's not even a matter of dispute. It's something you learn in kindergarten, whether you're in Yemen or in North Africa, and this was the eye-opener for me when it came to the vav. I was taught at the Hebrew University in original Hebrew, it was a wa. And then I went to a synagogue of Jews from Egypt, and they were reading from the Torah, and there were some old men there reading from the Torah, and they read the vav, and the gimel they pronounced as a ra without the dot, meaning they did have these distinctions. But when it came to the vav, they pronounced it as a va. And I went to one of the older people. I said, wait a minute. You've been living in Israel for 30 years, and that's why you pronounce it as a va, right? But back in Egypt, you said wa. He said, no. We've always pronounced this as a va. Huh. Well, that's not what I was told. I was told the Sephardic Jews, that the Ashkenazic Jews pronounce the letter vav as a va, and the Sephardic Jews pronounce it as a wa, and that turned out to be a bold-faced lie, or just ignorance. There were two Sephardic communities who pronounced it as wa. Those were the Yemenite and Southern Iraqi or Central Iraqi Baghdadi Jews. But for example, the Jews of Northern Iraq pronounce it as a va. And this is the I get this all the time to this day. People will say, well, that is the Ashkenazic Jews who pronounce it as a va, but the Sephardim know it's a wa. And it's the influence of, and this part is true, that Yiddish is a dialect of German and there is no wa sound. That is the one true statement in this whole thing. But to say that the va pronunciation was influenced by Yiddish, well, then why did the Jews of Damascus, who were a community up until, I believe it was 2016 or 2015, I think I just, oh yeah, okay, everything's working. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you.
Okay, so until 2016, you had spit on my spittle on the. I was spraying it, not saying it. How to clean off the screen here. Sorry about that. So until 2015 or 2016, you had a Jewish community in Damascus that were there probably since the time of King David and King Solomon, when they ruled over Damascus, but certainly going back to Hellenistic times. And those Jews in their community, for thousands of years, pronounced the Hebrew letter Vav as a V, not as a W. The Jews of northern Iraq, who actually to this day, they're the older people who are now living in Israel and they're not in Iraq, thank God, because they'd be under ISIS rule. But they're now living in places like New York and Argentina and Israel. When they read from the Torah and they pronounce the letter Vav, and in their prayers they pronounce it as a V, and that's an Aramaic-speaking community, so which is a Semitic language. So why don't they pronounce it as a W? And some of them speak, like for example, the Jews of Damascus speak Arabic, which has the W sound. So imagine that you go to a synagogue in Damascus 2 years ago, and if you're not killed, you hear them read from the Torah, and in their daily speech, the sound V does not exist because they're Arabic speakers. But when they read from the Torah, all of a sudden they read YEHOVAH or Vahavta. Let me get this right. Yeah, sorry, it's a dot in the tav. So they'll read YEHOVAH. So wait a minute. There's two v's in YEHOVAH. That's in the Shema. YEHOVAH et, and they'll read Adonai, of course, by tradition. Et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha. Levavcha. That is how it would be read by a Damascus Jew, by an Egyptian Jew, by a Moroccan Jew. So wait a minute. Where's this V sound coming from? It's not coming from Ashkenazic. It's not coming from German. They don't know German. They're living in Syria. They're living in Morocco. What do they know from German? It's ridiculous. I mean, just on its face, it's a ridiculous argument. Where does it come from? It doesn't come from their daily speech. It comes from something that predates their daily speech. So let's talk about the Jews in Damascus. They've probably been there since the time of Solomon, but without question since Second Temple times, right? So at least the first century, there were Jews in Damascus, right? We have in the New Testament, Paul, he visited Damascus. He made some trouble there, right? You had Jews in Damascus back then, right? So where do they get this V sound? The Arabs have been ruled over Damascus since, I believe, the 630s or thereabouts, right? So since around the year 630 something, 630, I don't know, 2, 6, I'm not an expert on Syrian history. I know they conquered Jerusalem in 638, and so presumably Damascus around that time. So since the 630s, there's been no V sound in the daily speech of anybody in Damascus, but they still have that V in their language. For the Jews are the one community that have that. So maybe there are other communities who speak other languages, I don't know. But it's not in their daily speech. It's when they read from Scripture and they read the Hebrew language, and then their prayers. Their daily prayers that Jews have prayed every day for the last 2,000 years. And I grew up reciting prayers. These are the same prayers that if Yeshua went to the temple, that he would have heard some of these same prayers recited by the high priest. For example, the Amidah, or at least the core of the Amidah, not the part that was added later. He would have heard the high priest reciting this. And these are prayers that were never lost, that were always part of the Jewish tradition. I grew up saying these prayers, maybe not always, but going back to the first century, at least they were. And Jews have always recited these prayers, and they preserved the letter V in that prayer, in those prayers, except in Arabic countries where some of the Jews, like in Yemen and Baghdad, they adopted the Arabic pronunciation W. Now, maybe in ancient Hebrew it was W, but show me the evidence for that. I don't know. No one's shown me the evidence. Right. So no. Now, one of the arguments they try to make is that, well, in certain instances, the Hebrew letter Vav is pronounced as a what's called matris lectionis, or imot kriya, or em kriya in the singular, which is a vowel helper. I call it a vowel helper. And what that means is if you write, let's take the word mavet, which is death. So mavet has a Vav. So if you say to die, it's mut. Mm-hmm. And that Vav is then a vowel helper that indicates it's mut. And another form of that is mot, which is mem, and all three are spelled consonantally, mem, vav, tav. So they say, wait a minute, in those instances, the vav is and o. Okay, so what? Therefore what? That tells me that it's pronounced w, not v. How does it tell me that at all? What it tells me is that it's preserved that vav, and what happened is it preserved that vav as a letter of the root. and the Mavet changed to Mot or Mut, and then the Vav just happened to be there, and then over time it was associated with the sounds O and U. And I'll give you an example of that. The word Bereshit, the first word in the Torah, has an aleph. Does that aleph indicate an A sound of or an S sound of Bereshit? No, the aleph is there, part of the root. We call this an historical spelling, meaning you have a silent aleph which is only there for one purpose, that it's part of the root. It's no longer pronounced, at least in that form of the word. And over time, yes, the aleph was associated with the sound A because it appeared there. And the same thing happens with the hey at the end of many words, right? So you have a hey, which is part of the root, haya, and you could write haya just hey yud. And you find in some early Hebrew writings that they have very interesting spellings which defy what we would expect. Like, for example, Shiloh is spelled with a hey at the end. And there are instances where that hey is associated with the sound O. There's nothing O or A about the hey sound. It's a H sound. But it was associated with these different vowels and then came to represent those vowels in certain instances. You see this particularly in Punic, which is a dialect of Phoenician, which is really a corrupt form of Hebrew, that these various letters take on a vowel character because there was some word where they were kept, and then they were then used as vowels. You also see it in Yiddish, by the way. But it's definitely, that's what's happening in Hebrew. It's not that there's something w about that sound, it's that it's an O. There's an O sound there, and it's kept as a historical spelling in the word mot or mut. I don't know if that makes any sense. If you don't know Hebrew, that probably sounds very confusing. But
this is okay. So this is very important, brothers and sisters, and I know that people from all spectrums are going to be listening to this, Nehemia. So I'm really glad that you're actually you're explaining these technical things, because the people that are interested in the technical explanation, they're going to love this. They're going to love that you're going into this. And brother, I know there's sincere people out there looking at this, and just to say that this idea that it has to be a wa, or if we say it is a vav originally, we have the evidence for that. And if you want to say it's a wa or wow more correctly, that you just feel 100% on this based on what, and you can try to base it on something if you want. But brothers and sisters, ultimately, look at this. This is serious information, and there's a lot of people that are into the Paleo Hebrew word pictures, and all of these theories that they've come up with, and it's in all these new Christian dictionaries and all of this stuff that's out there, and there's YouTube teachers and they claim they're Torah teachers and all these things. If Nehemia tries to talk to them in Hebrew, or if anyone tries to speak to them in the Hebrew language, they cannot speak Hebrew. They don't know Hebrew, and they don't even really know biblical Hebrew grammar. And if they can speak any Hebrew, they're basing it on the Masoretic text. And this takes us to the next little section. For a moment, if we have time, Nehemia, if you would like to go into it.
Before you get to that, I do want to, I try really to be careful. And you're probably right. A lot of these people don't know Hebrew, but there was a rabbi, I think his name was Yitzchak Cohen, and he wrote a book in Hebrew called Sfat Emet or something like that. I have it in my study. I have it on my shelf over here, the book. And he did speak Hebrew. He was a fluent Hebrew speaker, and he argued it was a wa. Yeah. And so this isn't a matter. I don't want to make this a matter of, well, do they know Hebrew or not? This really is with it. Here's what we can say for sure. Let's just put out the facts and leave aside all opinion. Okay. In the 20th and 21st century, there were Jews who pronounced the letter Vav as a V. That was most Jews in most places, even most Sephardic Jews. There were a handful of Jewish communities who had the W sound when they read Hebrew, primarily the Yemenite and the Baghdadi Jews. That is a fact. So if you want to say, well, what is an authentic Jewish sound? And if I call God Yehovah versus YEHOVAH, YEHOVAH versus YEHOVAH, then okay, that's an authentic sound. You sound like a Yemenite or Baghdadi Jew, no problem, right? Right. I'm from the Midwest. I interact with people all the time who are, from the South, and they speak English a little bit differently. And that really is the sort of distinction. Or maybe it's like speaking to somebody from England, right?
All right.
What you cannot say, and be honest, is that V is an alien sound to the Hebrew language that comes from the German or from the Ashkenazim or from the Yiddish. That is factually untrue and dishonest. It's just wrong. In fact, what probably almost certainly happened based on the evidence is the W sound was introduced from Arabic into the Hebrew language sometime in the 600s in certain Jewish communities, possibly later. They may have hung on. There's certainly, by the 10th century, meaning the 900s, you had Jews who pronounced the letter Vav as W. So it's not even just a modern thing. And of course the V goes back to biblical times. We can show. So
Yeah.
So those are the facts. In the biblical times, we have V. In certainly through the 6th century, we definitely have V. And we have W that shows up in the 10th century, 400 years later. Could it originally have been one Paleo-Hebrew? Anything's possible. And the example I bring is that in the book of Judges, it talks about most Israelites said the sound sh, and this was the code word in the battle with the tribes, and they said say the word shibolet, and most the people of Ephraim, literally to save their lives, couldn't say shibolet. It came out as sibolet. So V and was is no different than shibolet. Maybe what existed. There's no evidence for it from biblical times, meaning before the Arabic period. As far as I know, there's no evidence, but maybe it did exist. So you can't slap someone's hand and say, well, if you say Yahweh, it's, or let's take the example, YEHOVAH, that it's wrong because it's really YEHOVAH. I think it's not original, but it could be YEHOVAH. Meaning, or let me say it differently. There could have been Jews in the time of Ezekiel who said YEHOVAH. We don't know that for a fact. What we know for a fact is there were Jews who said YEHOVAH. Okay, I hope that's clear.
That comes out very clear, and I actually like your openness on this, and I don't have a problem with people using the Wah either. I mean, I used it for 20 years, and I'm just where I'm at with it, and I think it's good to be open with it, and it is like you said, it is an ancient, going back at least 1,000 years, an old pronunciation.
Yeah, 1,000 years.
There's at least there's evidence of it.
Arabic speaking countries, yeah.
Exactly, in Arabic speaking countries. And to be clear on this, and yet, people, when I just put out a video when I started to share with the world that I had understood the name differently than I had previously done it. I just said Yud Hey Vav Hey on a YouTube video, and people went ballistic.
Really?
Because I said Vav and not Wah.
They're just ignorant. I mean, that's just pure ignorance, and it's just factually wrong. So Joseph, one of the things that happened to me is when 20 plus years ago, wow, I'm old. Many years ago, I knew everything. And I was very judgmental of anybody who didn't have all the facts that I had. And over the years, I found out, wow, I was wrong about all these different things as I've learned and grown. And I realized I'm not so sure the me of 20 years ago would be so merciful on the me of today. I think he would rebuke me as a know-it-all and say that Nehemia is wrong and blah, 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 without even looking at the facts, because I thought I knew everything, right? And then I studied at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I went and I found out there were libraries full of things that I didn't know, and I literally got to visit some of those libraries. So what I try to think is, okay, so somebody's doing something that I think is wrong in their, out of innocence, doing the best they can. Well, I did things that I now think are incorrect innocently. I know my own motives, so I'm not going to cast aspersions. I want to try not to cast aspersions on other people, So in other words, if you could clone yourself and go back in time, right, with what you know now, what would your response be to the Joseph Israel of 10 years ago or 5 years ago, right? Or even a year ago, right?
Right.
So that's how I try to think about it. And that really makes me humble. That humbles me before the creator of the universe. He's the only one who has all the truth. And I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
Oh, man. I love that about you, Nehemia. And I love how you and Keith also bring that out together, and just how, you all bring this amount of love for truth and love for humanity, and actually being willing that there's just this part that Paul says, Shaul, he says, let Elohim prove true, and even if every man's a liar, we all fall short. We all can say something that's false, but the Almighty, He is always right.
That's true. Amen. Isn't that the truth? Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So what was the next thing you want to talk about before I interrupted you?
No, I think this is good, and I just really like the mercy and really getting into the Hain, and like last week's Torah portion when the Almighty really revealed His mercy with the children of Israel Once
Yeah.
they worship the golden calf, and it's such a terrible thing that they did this, and we think about it, and people wonder why the Israelites did this and how could they do it. But then I look at it and I think, well, we're doing, the human race is doing this over and over and over again, constantly falling into idolatry. But even when we fall so short and get lost along the way, look what happened with the basically the Brit Hadashah, the renewal of the covenant with the children of Israel. He brought forth his attributes, his divine attributes that have been there from the beginning, and we got a better understanding of our Creator, even through our own falling short, and this is constantly being revealed. And so as we draw nearer and nearer to him, and these times of fulfillment that I believe we're living in, that maybe his people, that I pray his people, all of us, could get closer and closer to reflecting these divine attributes, because we are created in the Tselem Elohim. We are in his image, and that we also shouldn't be merciful and slow to anger and full of kindness and all these things. And though we have lots to learn. And so I really appreciate you slowing down and bringing that forward, because I've been getting some emails from some beautiful people that use the pronunciation YEHOVAH, and they're willing to look at YEHOVAH now based on this divine name study I brought out, and they're going to go to your website and start to listen to a few of the things that you're bringing out. And I respect people that are sincere coming from any direction with this name pronunciation. And I really think if you're honest and everyone's honest, I think that they will reach the same conclusion that we have. But it's really up to them and between them and the Creator. And this is the beautiful thing. And like you always say on your website and through your podcast, you're presenting people with information. And so as we go forward on this, the Masoretic text was because basically there's people that naturally there's this and I'll just call it for what it is. There's an anti-Semitism even amongst people that love the scriptures and even think that their Hebrew roots or whatever is going on here. There's an anti-Semitic, and it's getting stronger and stronger.
Uh-oh. Are you there? Hello? Let's see if my connection is still... Yeah, I'm still connected. Maybe I'm not connected. Hello? No, I'm connected to the internet. I don't hear you. Are you there? Should I leave the call? I don't know. Hello? Uh-oh. Okay, I don't think that will